And so the students wrote first, many described a moment of reorientation. The session reminded them why they choose medicine in the first place. The combination of artistic and clinical perspectives opened a space that felt more human and less procedural than what they experience in everyday training. And second, several reflected on how film and artistic storytelling create a different kind of access to medical experience, one that is emotional rather than technical. And students wrote that this allowed them to understand patients' inner worlds in ways that they rarely encounter in clinical routines. And third, the session prompted a deep look at stigma and categorization. The examples discussed, especially how we distance ourselves from difficult or uncomfortable topics, made them realize how quickly assumptions shape clinical judgment. Art, they felt, opens a safer space to confront these complexities honestly. Overall, the reflections show a strong desire for more and these interdisciplinary spaces, places where medicine and art expand each other and help future clinicians see more, feel more, and understand more. Thank you. And now I give the word to Lukas.
So thank you so much, Anne Berghöfer, for the reflection. So this is kind of how it works, that for the students that are amongst us here, they send in short reflections after each lecture, kind of what stayed with them, what inspired them, what made them think. And this is kind of what we always read out in the beginning of each new kind of dialogue here to kind of make a connection to the last time. So thank you again, Anne, and good evening and a warm welcome to another edition of the Healing Arts Encounters in Arts and Medicine here at the Charité Berlin. My name is Lucas Feyreis, and it's my pleasure to host the series on behalf of the International Society for Arts and Medicine, which brings together voices from medicine, from science, and the arts to explore how we understand care, illness, and healing when different forms of knowledge and experience meet. And a special thank you also to you, Vanessa, who's making all of this happening here, Vanessa Weiss, and you, Jakob, as well, for being able to stream the whole thing, so for our online audience. So from the beginning, the healing arts has been less about presenting finished answers than about staging encounters. Encounters between disciplines, between methods, between practitioners, between different ways of being in the world. And tonight, we closely look at one practice that lies at the heart of both art and medicine, science and healing, but is rarely reflected on its shared terms, the experiment. Experiments are usually imagined as the domain of laboratories and protocols, but experiments also happen in rehearsal rooms, in studios, on stages, and in the clinic, in teaching, and in everyday forms of care. They mark moments when we step into uncertainty on purpose, when we set up a situation whose outcome we do not fully control in the hope that something new might emerge. Maybe experiments and experimental thinking helps us to reimagine medicine, not only as a discipline oriented towards diagnosis, prediction, and intervention, but also as a practice of attention, of listening, and transformation. In the arts, not only as a realm of representation or expression, but also as a space for sensing, for experimenting, and rehearsing new forms of care. So, to explore these questions, we are joined tonight by two extraordinary guests who who have been in dialogue before and who, each in their own way, rethink what experiments are and what they do. Professor Dr. Hans-Jörg Rheinberger, actually, I start with a personal anecdote. I first became aware of his writings through my old philosophy professor, the Wille Kremer, in a book she wrote many years ago, and then became a large fan, actually, of you, Mr. Rheinberger, in this like scientific, philosophical, and very, very poetic way of writing and, I don't know, playing with words. But Rheinberger studied philosophy, linguistics, and biology in Tübingen and Berlin, received his MA in philosophy, a degree in biology, his doctorate, and his habilitation in molecular biology. And I believe for almost 20 years, he served as director for the history of science at the Max Planck Institute here in Berlin. And his work has fundamentally shaped how we think about scientific practice, especially in the life sciences, from the history and epistemology of molecular biology and experimentation to the complex relations between the arts and science. In his one of his recent books, Spalt and Fuge, he develops a phenomenology of the experiment that examines the productive in-between spaces where knowledge emerges, those gaps and joints where the known and the unknown meet. Lucie Strecker, I've known quasi my entire life, but we haven't seen each other in many decades. So we met through our parents as children. And it's been maybe 15 years or longer that we haven't seen each other, and it's beautiful kind of to reconnect this way. But Lucie Strecker works internationally as an artist, curator, and author since 2016, I believe. She has been based at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, where she led research projects such as the Performative Biofact and Shaken Ground, Seismography of Precarious Presences. She teaches performance art in the Department of Art and Communication Practices, as well as the Applied Performance Laboratory. Her artistic work, shown in museums, theaters, and research contexts around the world, often involves living materials, biotechnological processes, and more than human actors. She has engaged deeply with the notion of the pharmakon, healing remedy and poison at once, exploring how artistic experiments can expose the ambivalences of care, risk, and vulnerability. Hans-Jörg Rheinberger and Lucie Strecker have already met in conversation in many contexts. Tonight, we continue their dialogue from within a medical institution. And even more strikingly, from within an old anatomical theater, historically a space for both experiment and performance. So we will start with a short opening reflection from each of our guests, followed by a conversation between us and always the space for your questions and contributions. This is what this evening lives from, is basically, in particular in an intimate setting as ours, in a common conversation between all of us. So thank you again for being here tonight, for listening, for thinking with us, and for helping to keep this experimental space alive. Let's begin. I would like to ask Hans-Jörg Rheinberger to the stage.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here in front of you this evening. Although I have to begin, and I'm sorry for that, I have to begin with a confession. I never felt an affinity for medicine. Although I grew up in a medical doctor's household, I early on decided that I would never become a medical doctor. Instead, I studied biochemistry. And ended up in a laboratory for molecular biology, actually at the Max Planck Institute for Molecular Genetics in Berlin, Dahlem. At that time, molecular biology was still completely based on work with bacteria and their phages and their viruses, namely phages. Medical applications of that work, I personally actually worked on elucidating the molecular mechanism of protein biosynthesis, a ubiquitous metabolic pathway, probably the most important besides genetic reproduction, occurring in every cell, be it bacteria or eukaryotes. At that time, medical applications of that work only appeared, if they did at all, at the far horizon. That was the late 1970s and the early 1980s. At the time, and you can imagine the leap that has occurred since that time within a period of about 30 years. Now, at the time when things started to change at the beginning of the 1990s, I had already left the laboratory and was on my way of becoming a historian of science for the second part of my academic career. Today, I wrote in the Tagesspiegel that you still can switch and start something new when you are 84. Now, two major topics that I should briefly mention, and that resulted in two books, have kept me busy for a long time. The first one carries the title Toward a History of Epistemic Things, and it deals with experimental systems. And the second one has just been shown here. There is also an English edition of that. The title is Split and Splice, a Phenomenology of Experimentation. Now, the history of the life sciences throughout the 19th and the early and the whole 20th century, of course, has told me how narrowly medicine and biology have been intertwined in the long run of these 2 centuries. And today, things have intensified to the extent that the contemporary medical and life sciences are appearing as one big biomedical complex. Now, the consequences, as you know, or at least the people who are working in the realm of medicine, the consequences are multiple. And in an age of what is being called translational medicine, the character of basic research is certainly about to profoundly change. However, I could go on here, but I actually wanted to tell a slightly different story. A story that brings us to the arts. It has to do with my efforts and that have been mentioned in the introduction to understand and to present the practice of research, and in particular of scientific experimentation in its manifold and very different facets. The two books that I just mentioned that resulted from this effort, and a third one whose title is an epistemology of the concrete. It appeared around 2010. Were actually conceived for the community of historians and philosophers of science as their main audience. To my great surprise, however, I got more and more reactions and feedback about this work from people who were working in the realm of the arts, broadly speaking, and in particular from those concerned in one form or another with the internationally expanding movement of artistic research. One of them, Lucie Strecker, is sitting next to me this evening. Now the surprise turned into an interest on my part. More and more, I was drawn into conversations and interactions with artistic researchers and curators of exhibitions. In particular, it involved artists who were working with biological materials and or bits and pieces of equipment that were or still are in use in scientific research laboratories. Concerning the arts and research, we can make an analytical distinction, I think. An artist can either make use of materials and methods that are also used in scientific research and turn them into an arsenal of artistic tinkering. Alternatively, an artist can conceive of their own work itself as an ongoing experimental process. More often than not, these two aspects are both together involved in an artist's work. I should say in passing that this is the fate of all analytical distinctions that we make in the realm of theory. In practice, they never occur in pure form. Now, let us look at two examples, both of them from the realm of an artistic engagement with the life sciences. The first concerns an aspect of the work of Paul Vanus, an artist based at the University of New York at Buffalo in the United States. In the years around 2010, Vanus was experimenting with materials and procedures in use in laboratories around the world, genetic, medical, forensic, and more, concerned with sequencing bits and pieces of DNA. Vanus was using the techniques to draw attention to the fact that sequencing, in particular sequencing human DNA, comes with a plethora of ethical, legal, and social consequences. Among them, stigmatization, racial and medical discrimination. He did this by using the indexical sequencing technology to produce images that can be read in an iconic or in a symbolic fashion. There is also a philosophical background, of course, to this. The terms indexical, iconic, and symbolic are used by Charles Sanders Peirce in his influential theory of science. Vanus called his products latent figures. And one of them is shown here. keep it. Yeah, just let it. You can look at it. The second example is of a different nature, but it also involves the life science, laboratories. And it spans a much more extended period of time. It concerns the work of Hannes Rikli, a Swiss artist based at Zurich University of Arts, Zürcher Hochschule der Künste. Rikli started with the construction of a tracing sphere inspired by spheres that biologists use to trace and measure the movements of tiny insects. He positioned it, however, in the center of a light beam installation in such a way that visitors could, through their own movements, interact with the light beams and accordingly their traces left on the slowly turning globe. Can you show the second one? Yeah. Now from there, Rikli went on to interact more intensely with biological laboratories, but with a particular twist. He began to use visual and audio raw data produced en masse by biologists who are investigating the acoustic, who were at that time investigating the acoustic communication of fish, Gernards in the event, Knurrhähne in German, das Knurren hört man bis hier, and turned them into videograms. The scientists, on the other hand, started from the very same raw data, but filtered them in a completely different way, so that in the end, a traditional scientific article was the result. This twist, in turn, gave rise to an extended discussion about the nature of data, both in the sciences and in the arts. In a follow-up project, the artist Rikli began to focus on what the scientists try to exclude from their results, namely the signals that are produced by the recording instruments themselves. In the event, an underwater camera placed in Spitzbergen on the bottom of the sea in order to track life in Arctic waters over several months. What for the scientists was mere noise became material for video and sound installations for the artist. I stop here. For those of you interested in this work, there is a long conversation between the scientists involved, the artist Hannes Rikli, and a couple of historians and philosophers of science. And the discussion is assembled in this book, Natures of Data. If you are interested in more examples and reflections about the intricate relations between the sciences and the arts, on the other hand, in particular around the topic of experimentation, you can have a look at my most recent book that just came out, In Touch, Encounters Between Art and Research. And the two examples I have been showing are taken from this book. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Ich glaube aber, das Mikrofon reicht nicht, oder reicht das? Ja? Okay. Gut. ich rückwärts gehen auf den Anfang. Okay, so sound is fine? Okay, great. Thank you again, Hans-Jörg Rheinberger, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really an honor to continue the dialogue. And I admit that my interest in medicine is maybe coming from my family. I'm also very honored that you're here, my mother, coming from a family of, I think, how many generations of physicians? 10. So, and then I realized at some point on my path that there's also a generation of 4 generations of artists. And I'm still trying to make sense of all of this. And probably, as you just said, you can see an artistic practice as a process, as a research, and I assume being here with you today is one other step in this process. It was not so easy for me to commit to medicine, coming from a background of painting, coming from a background of theater directing, and then engaging with the medical body, not only on an anatomical level, but also, holy fuck, that is happening inside of me. So what is the molecular body? And I started in 2011 to explore the immune system also as a choreographic script, using Laban notation to trace the movement of cells and trying to put this on stage. And in 2011, I mean, also it was my first piece. It was much more a narrative. So we used a film, it's called Fictional Offender. It's a film from the 60s where scientists are injected into the bodies, and it's the first time that 12-tone music is used in science fiction film. And of course, the evil and the bad are the viruses, and the goods are the macrophage. And so everything was quite clear in the time of the Cold War. But then slowly, our understanding what is self and foreign has been picked up by philosophers, anthropologists, and so on. And from this point, I started to realize that I'm engaging in something, that is a very different realm from painting and from directing. So, Lucas, you said it would be nice if I show a little bit on what I've been working on the last years and what brought me to what you also announced as the figure or the term, the pharmacon. So I will make a very quick journey with you through some of the works I did in the last years, arriving at 2021 in Zurich, where I was invited at the memory clinic, where I started a series also of experiments and self-experiments I called Poetopharmaca. So from here on, I would still like to show you a couple of works. So we're going backwards from my portfolio, that is a collection of selected works. This work is called Spit Party. So it was another step where I involved bodily fluids, but not only on the level as we can perceive saliva, but also looking at the ingredients of saliva. So what you can see here down there are harvested spit samples, and you can see a couple that is kissing on the back where you mix saliva, and from there we were starting a performative experiment, let's say. I will only show you the works that and the materialities, because each of the work is a live performance and would be too long to show you a snippet from the documentation. So here you can also see again cells as a keyword, living and dying. It was a performative auction where we auctioned a Joseph Beuys clone that we created from dried blood of a hare that I bought in another auction. I bought dry hare's blood in a multiple by Joseph Beuys, and then we took this blood, we discussed with restorers if it's allowed to take this blood, then we brought it to the laboratory, tried to reinactivate a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of this DNA, and we brought it back into an auction system. So again, here I tried very hard to make non-human material part of a performance that still has the human experimenter as its center. You can see here the well-dressed auctionist, making a good show to sell the piece. So it was called Hare's Blood Plus. Here we see an animal and a psychoanalyst. You see the dog that played the dog of Sigmund Freud in a movie. And we took his hair to create a timer. And we also have a psychoanalyst who is donating his blood. So we're taking a little bit of DNA from the dog that played the dog of Sigmund Freud into Lacanian, into the blood cell of a Lacanian psychoanalyst to create a new timer for a psychoanalytic session. That was a durational performance because everything takes very long. But the biological processes take even longer. So it's still a small snippet that is sometimes, as you also realized it, also faking parts, making a story out of it. So I will rush through this. So here you see again 2 works that have the original Joseph Beuys work and the clone Joseph Beuys piece. This was an alteration of the same work, including menstrual blood from a New York-based artist, doing a show in Buffalo with Paul Vanus, who you just cited. Paul Vanus has a lab, so we really cultivate this dialogue, you know, to spend time together, to go into the lab and work there. And he always backed me, and he said, please, Lucie, stay true to the material. Because most of my works tended to be a bit baroque, fiction, narration, but not processing this kind of performativity of materiality in the sense that maybe leads to more true nature of the performativity of matter. But I tend to mix different ways of, storytelling maybe. Maybe it's a way of storytelling. So I'm going over time now. So I'm flipping through to the work that I call Poetopharmaca. This is already one image that we will see later on a short video. It's using words from a quote by Derrida on Platon's Pharmacy about the pharmakon. So he uses these oppositional terms, Seele, Körper, Gedächtnis, Vergessen, Sprache, Schrift, draußen, drinnen, gut, böse, as terms that seem to be in opposition, but as the pharmakon is also not only poison or remedy, play around this idea of was ist ein Mittel, so what is a medium. So you can see here another image where I'm trying to arrive from a process of looking at memory to very tiny little poetopharmaca that turn into an image or a piece of art. And from here, I would like to show a video and read a very short text fragment from an interview that I was leading together with one of the scientists that were part of the memory clinic in Zurich. And I still have a couple of minutes, right? So before we start the video, I'd like to give you a frame, you know, or tell you the conditions of me being invited as an artist to participate in studies on dementia. So we have this Artist in Labs program in Zurich. It is a series of residencies for artists that engage in different forms, also in medical research. And this particular residency was dedicated to questions of dementia. So how do we remember? What do we forget? Who are we if we start to remember differently? And it entailed to accompany patients in their anamnesis of dementia. So the memory clinic was a group of scientists and physicians that included me doing, first of all, tests on my own. So I was trying to test my own ability to remember things, but they also allowed me to talk to patients, which had a very strong impact on me. And I remember that the first session we had was a patient who considered exit. Exit is, I don't know if you're familiar, it's the Swiss program for, what is the English word for it? I don't know, Sterbebegleitung. So the really very first initial moment at the memory clinic where I wanted to do my poetopharmaca was very real. And from there, I had a studio. I, on a regular basis, went to the memory clinic, but I also went to a theoretician who was doing interviews with patients, and we talked about her methods on taking interviews and documenting what do patients talk about, what and how do relatives talk about this phenomena of, or this, process of losing one's memory, but also how do scientists interact with patients. So I really took this condition of language as part of my particular research. And maybe you like to start the video. It's one video work that is, it's a draft. And I like to read a couple of notes from this interview that I had with the scientist who was leading these interviews. So we're conducting this conversation as part of the Artists in Labs program, The Persistence of Memory. While reading interviews in the DPEEK study, I noticed that the positions of roles of those involved shift. Patients, relatives, and interviewers sometimes switch roles during these conversations. But who are you in this exchange with me now? As replying, can one actually conduct an interview with a researcher who accompanies this study? Of course one can, but it is a major change of roles because I'm usually the one who analyzes these conversations and works through them scientifically. And now I am the one who is supposed to speak. So it's a double uncertainty. Bitte. I reply, on one hand, there is the experience of being in the flow of speaking. And then the moment when this experience reappears in written language, in writing. So then she keeps talking how it happens that she's trying to edit the clips and how to transfer the process of talking about forgetting into the residue of language. And when we go back to the question of what the pharmacon etymologically was, no, it's a term that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that first appeared in a discussion that Plato wrote down between Teut, the god who invented language and mathematics, and Theseus, the king in Egypt at the time. And both are discussing, is the pharmakon, is language, what they called also pharmakon, is it a poison for the memory, or is it a remedy for the memory? And therefore, a whole discussion starts, what is poison and what is remedy? And I really felt that the idea of language as being constantly between something that keeps memory, but also distracts us from a continuous permanent presence and flow and an activation of thinking was fitting for this particular residency. And I'm ending this dialogue with a short passage where I reflect on my take on the Poetopharmaca, and there I will end. It will be another half a minute. So I'm talking to Andrea, the scientist, and I tell her the Poetopharmaca I work with are for me memory containers, holding healing or poisonous effects of poetry. In Plato's Phaedrus, it is discussed whether writing is a remedy or a harmful substance or prothesis, and leading to forgetting. So Jacques Derrida's deconstruction of the Platonic concept of the pharmakon in Platon's Pharmacy says the pharmakon is ambivalent because it forms the very middle in which opposites can oppose each other. Memory, forgetting, speech, writing. Something always acts independence on several factors. And now the transcribed interviews are important. A situation congeals into writing, which then serves to read out something new. I also look at the work with interviews formally, the typography, your handwriting, what happens when you yourself are involved in an interview. So multiple folded steps flow back into the situation and the spoken language. The figure of the pharmakon has its mythological origin in the debate on writing versus freely spoken language in relation to memory. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for being here. It's an honor to have both of you here on stage with us in the Healing Arts. And maybe we can start with a very kind of simple question, because you both described an unexpected or almost surprising transition into a different realm of research and experience. You described how your work was suddenly perceived much stronger from the artistic realm, even though it was actually written for more philosophical or community of those of the history of science. And you described how you suddenly, from staging theater, went more into scientific research. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about these moments of transitions of what we would call in German Wissenschaft to Wissenskunst, or from science to a knowledge of the arts.
Yeah.
Are you still connected with your microphone?
I think I'm connected.
Yeah. Sounds very loud.
So I don't know whether I have a good answer to this. The problem, I think we have to, or I, for my part, have to start from a basic experience that I made in my laboratory work. And that is that you are confronted when you do these kinds of experiments with unintended consequences. I think we could translate the notion of pharmacon into unintended consequence, because something different happens from what you expect. And probably this is also, if I see it correctly, the most important aspect of all medical work, being confronted with unintended consequences. You start a therapy and it doesn't work the way that you think it should. And you have to change your mind on the way. And this can be at a smaller scale, at the micro scale, but it can also be at the macro scale. When you are doing experimental work, the experiment develops through these steps of things that happen that you have not anticipated, and that sometimes lead you in a completely different direction, at least in the long run. What you judge to be a noise at the beginning turns into something that is interesting enough to be pursued. And the same thing can happen on a biographical level. And I think that is what you were asking. It is very difficult to give one reason for these kinds of transitions. Usually it starts with more or less insignificant events that you probably at the very moment when they happen, you do not even realize that they will have in the long run these kinds of consequences. You just engage with something and it can lead you in the end, it can lead you into a different direction. And for me, in my own work, this has been something. So my engagement with artists and with artistic work and curators' work has of course this kind of character, but for me that was not a term that put me into a completely different world, because it had its feedback into my own thinking about doing experiments as a scientist. So this can have repercussions to what you have been doing before, and you are conceiving things in a different way afterwards. And for that reason, you possibly could compare the two books that I mentioned at the beginning, the one toward the history of epistemic things and the other one, Split and Splice. And you will see the difference between.
How about you, Lucie?
Please repeat the last term, but it's the
Wissenschaft und Wissenkunst. And my interest is
Wissenskunst.
Wissenkunst, genau, sozusagen as two complementary terms of gaining knowledge and the arts of the knowledge of the arts and the sciences. But it's interesting, what I like so much, that kind of art came relatively late in your biography into your kind of thinking domain. And for you, coming from the arts and from painting, performance, you eventually started working more and more with scientists. So I was more curious biographically how that transition felt, like when that happened, and how you would describe this to us.
Well, talking biographically, one of the first performances when I was probably 19 was me running through the woods of around Berlin in Sauen. Maybe some of you know, does it still exist?
Yeah, it does.
The residency place is Brandenburg. Yeah, so I was running around in the woods screaming a quote from an expressionist painter: "A painter should never speak." So I felt the burden somehow that as a painter, you know, I should generate knowledge, or I should create not by terms, cognition. And I had this urge to find words also and to look into methods. And then when the experiment came in, and I realized more through kind of my drive that I'm experimenting, I'm looking, I'm playing, but then I'm not having so much to do or to create a kind of beautiful artwork or go into the art markets, but where do I go then? And then I found also in your writing such an interesting take on how does an experiment work? And I felt, maybe also because already you have been in exchange with artists and the field of arts, that you're describing the experimental setup as something that is valuable for any kind of looking for something unexpected or new.
I was just thinking that maybe you also just put into question something that I've been saying here quite often as part of the Healing Arts series, that a couple of years ago I came to the preliminary conclusion that the arts, the sciences are evidence-based, historically speaking, whilst the arts are more ambivalence-based. And that's kind of the power of the arts. This is kind of where the two of them act complementary to one another. But if I think now about your definition of the experiment, this is highly ambivalence-based, and that's the whole point of the experiment, that it's right in between. So you're putting into question my approach to these things, but that's at the heart of the experiment, that it is based in ambivalence, in that gap, in that in-between. Am I quoting you correctly here?
Yes, certainly. And I think that this has become more and more one of my intentions to break up the traditional image that we have from what it means to be science or what it means to do science. You just mentioned it, evidence-based, yeah. And if you have this kind of cold and abstract idea of what sciences are about, and this idea is mostly taken from the paper form of the sciences, what is written down and what you can read in journals. But what you do in laboratories can be very different from what is written down in journals, and has taken a definite form that over 150 years has not changed anymore. Scientific article has to consist of these 4 different sections, and then this idea of what science is about has become deeply entrenched also in our everyday image of the sciences. And I thought we need to, in one way or the other, we need, in order to bring back life to the sciences and to the practice of research, we need to break up this image. And breaking up this image, I think, also opens, in a way, the possibility of interaction with other realms of productive and of creative, in parentheses, of creative work.
Yeah, beautiful. Do you want to add something?
I'm waiting for your next question. Maybe I can weave it in.
Yeah, But again, just to repeat, it's quite beautiful now for the audience or those that have followed this for longer, that we have a beautiful example of the experiment being actually a unifier between the arts and the sciences, or even the medical sciences, where these kind of two cultures idea, the art as one, art world as one culture and the science as the other, suddenly become unified in the experiment. What I would be curious in, because you've both worked in very different kind of situations, such as a research lab or a performance studio, or even a clinic, where would you say, where do you see similar experimental gestures or systems, and where do they differ from your experience? Maybe you can start there, Lucie.
Yeah, I can start with an example that you also published in this book. It's an interview between Jens Hauser, you and myself about a performative symposium in 2018, where we used a scientific experiment over 3 or 4 days, and including you talking about microperformativity, so giving a description of a scientific experiment, how it functions, how it works, what tools are used, also how sterile it needs to be, the time that is involved, that microagents grow. And so really giving an idea of this laboratory reality. And while you were giving this lecture, we asked you to repeat the keywords of the lecture and to harvest your saliva, and taking some cells or microbiome from the saliva and feed it into a performative experiment. And then later in this dialogue and the interview, you clearly distinguish, for example, hygiene, you know, is something, if I do a performative experiment, that really changes our understanding of how we're connected, what saliva is, that we really live in a world full of microbes, that maybe the microbes influence the gut. So all of this we could address through the artistic experiment, but nevertheless, there was a big gap between the scientific experiments that allow for these insights, because the conditions in a lab are still very different. So the input we gain from the artistic experiment are different here in this example from the one that we gain in a laboratory experiment. Was this clear enough to just explain, or?
Yeah, I think you can put it this way. Probably, I mean, we have also to see these kinds of interactions in a broader historical perspective, I guess. When I started my studies in the middle of the 1960s, it was still the canon of disciplines was still very strict. Yeah? To become a philosopher meant something completely different from becoming a historian, or from becoming a natural scientist, and even more so from practicing the arts. And I think over the course of these 50 years or more, things have started to slightly change. And it all started at the end of the 1950s or beginning of the 1960s with the catchword of interdisciplinarity. And then it moved on to transdisciplinarity, and I don't know what. So a lot of terms have been invented in the event and have appeared and have disappeared again. But I think on the whole, also if we look at the academic landscape at universities, things are very different from these very strict separations that still dominated universities in at the beginning of the 1960s and throughout the 1960s. And so actually we're living in a lucky time in that respect, possibly not politically.
Well, to say that my experience, theoretically, yes, there is this transdisciplinary approach, but in the real lived experience of university, it's very little there. So theoretically, it's picked up and it's en vogue, but I had a professorship for transdisciplinary artistic design, but the way it was implemented was, the idea is bigger than the actual implementation of it. But you want to add something to this? And
yeah,
then...
I wanted to add something. I think we should not underestimate the demand, and you have been mentioning that in your talk as well, the demand that is coming from the materials with which you are working. And of course, I mean, if you get acculturated into a laboratory of molecular biology that is working with bacteria, this is something different than when you are entering an archive when you are working as a historian. So there are different materials and still different scientific realms, or call them disciplines. I don't, probably not so important. But I think what is more important is to get an idea that in all these realms there are structural elements of work that can be compared with each other at another level, possibly not at the very level of the material you are working with, but at a level above where, and that's what I have been trying to make clear with my books. And also the terminology that had to be invented in this respect, because it didn't exist.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the work that you've done there over the years, because it's very important. I have a lot of questions, but maybe I'll look into the audience and see if there's first questions from the audience that want to. Yep, here's number one.
Thank you too so much. I have a few questions. The first one, so I mean, it was very interesting to hear about the artistic research, and it's, as I understand, something that especially artists can use, and it's very interesting to take methods from a different field and role.
Could you speak
up?
A little bit?
Sorry,
Yeah.
Of course, I don't have the loudest voice. I wonder if also there are methods that you know of that scientists took from artists. I mean, of course, there's now a science communication, and there is a bit more, I guess, like also methods are always developing, but do you know of concrete methods that also the arts may be brought into science, or is there a connection in that, like in that direction as well? I mean, maybe it's more complicated than that, but yeah.
I know this question. It reappears, and I have only one example in my pocket on a very superficial layer, but I tell it, and maybe you like to elaborate further, or you have another example. So Niels Stern, who developed, you know the example anyway. Okay, Niels Stern, who made a theory on the immune system as a hall of mirrors, a hall of mirror where the immune responses are constantly, and now I'm losing track because I'm not a biologist, but somehow he used the metaphor of a hall of mirrors to rethink of how the immune system functions. And he was deeply inspired by Jean Cocteau, and he spent, I think, many occasions, discussions. And as we all know, the work of Jean Cocteau is referring to the question of the mirror in many ways. So this is a very, it's just a little bit of an idea, and you and I, we could go deeper into it and look at it again.
Yeah, I think the history of the arts and also the history of the sciences is full of examples. If you go back a little further, of course, you have only to mention the Renaissance, but where you had figures like Leonardo, but also the 19th century. Look at one of the most important physicists of the 19th century, Helmholtz. He was deeply concerned with the ways that we perceive the world and also perceive works of art through his own take on the physiology of our senses. So trying to understand how vision works and trying to understand how hearing works, and then extending this to music and to painting. And I think in that sense, we are not living in a completely different world. But of course, the interactions are changing. I just am about publishing a book that deals with a very interesting French figure. He started out by studying physics and mathematics at the Sorbonne in Paris, and then became an engineer, and from there moved on into the history and philosophy of science, and at the same time started to concern himself with the images of the elements in literature. And after World War II in Paris was at that time one of the two centers of art in the world, New York and Paris. He had an extended network of artists with whom he interacted. And I think there is much more of these kinds of interactions going on that we superficially are seeing and are perceiving.
Hey, yeah, thank you both. I wanted to come back to this discussion of the interdisciplinarity, and particularly I've been quite taken tonight with this idea of the experiment as something that crosses between arts and science. But I'm left wondering how we might think about its value in the two different fields, because within the science, it seems like there are some quite straightforward instrumental ways about how we can value an experiment and some more complicated ways that we could think about valuing an experiment. But in the arts, it seems a little bit more ambiguous as to how we value that. And I'm thinking about this coming from the context. I was mostly working in the UK, where we have a lot of kind of artistic research programs, and the difficulty of how those have been kind of taken up within the infrastructure of the university system. Thinking in the UK, we call it the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. How do you somehow think about the value of artistic research and the way in which it's worked in that context, which is practical but lackluster or something? Is that like, if a scientist experiment gets published in a high quality journal, then it's good research, and if an artistic piece of research gets put in an internationally known gallery or museum context, therefore it's good artistic research. The quality of the work itself, though, is never, the quality is not really the word I want to use, though, but like what the work does and how it operates and how it might move as research, and these kinds of questions aren't really then touched upon. And I think this is one of the problems that's emerged with artistic research is a kind of phenomenon, and I was wondering if you both had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I would like to start from a distinction that appears to me to be very important. If you try to compare the arts and the sciences from the perspective of their products, what is written in a scientific paper or what you can see in a gallery or in an exhibition, the products look very different. Yeah. Sometimes scientists produce beautiful pictures, but certainly not always. And it is not their interest their interest is not in this kind of aesthetic aspect of the images they produce. So we have to look for another space where we can base our comparison. And I think it's the space of production, where artworks are produced and where scientific results are produced. Science in the making and art in the making, not from the perspective of the product. And if you take this kind of view, then I would claim that artists can be and even must be as rigorous as scientists are. And seldom an artist is finished with producing a piece of a painting or so, because it leaves something to be desired, and he goes on or she goes on to do the next one. And again, you have so many examples in the history of the arts. Look at Paul Cézanne and his hundreds, if not thousands, of apples he painted during his lifetime, one apple after another. And obviously, he never arrived at the point where he said, that is the definitive apple. So he continued because, and I would say this is an artistic experimental system that extends over 10 years or 20 years or even a lifetime. And that's how I see it.
If I may, I give a quick answer that does a little detour. For me, it was possible through artistic research to look into the valuable and the invaluable of what can be called the biopolitical imaginary of species being. What is that? So there's a little beautiful article that says that species is on one hand a category as such. Species is a very old term for coin, and species is also a biological being, no? And then through artistic research, for me, it's much more interesting to look at the value of life that changes through circulation, connectivity, but also in particular, the digital and the biotechnological revolution. So for me as a performance artist, that I sometimes am, and looking at the body and what it is to be a living being, and to bring this into a cycle of also the society we live in. So where and how does value changes? So for me, artistic research enables an exploration of what is the value of species being. That's a bit of a wild thing, but I throw it in here.
I have also a question. I want to ask about the collective aspect of experimentation, which we haven't talked about yet, and I know, Lucie, you're very invested in it with Shaking Ground, so the collective and so on, but I imagine also you're not alone and you've been working in a lab and with a team. Yeah, I was just wondering, in science and arts and experimentation, it's not a solitary, it's not a solitary research. So I was wondering what is the value of what brings collectivity in there, like co-creation in experimentation?
Yeah. Yes, you are right. If you look at the sciences, they are eminently, the work that is being done there is eminently collective. Scientists depend on so many things that other people around them are doing. And as long as you are comparing a collective of scientists with the genius of an artist, then you always have this kind of opposition between here you have a collective that is working, and then you have a lonely artist who is working on the other side of the divide. But if you look at a movement like the one that I have been mentioning in my introduction, artistic research, more often than not, you find that people are cooperating. And look at theater and look at how many interactions and how much collective work has to go into producing a piece of a theater piece. It is not only the one who writes it, it is the one who stages it and so on and so on. You probably know that much better than I. It's eminently collective, and wherever you work and wherever you are looking, you find that artwork is as collective as scientific work. Which does not exclude the input of each and every individual and the distinctive input of them.
Yeah, and furthermore, what you also describe in the epistemology des Konkreten is that we also try to shift from the human actors also to, you know, how do relations, interrelations change if we include what we can broadly call performativity of matter, but also when we look at interspecies being. So it's really very, very slow shift. And for me, coming from a directing school where the most exciting thing was to see a male actor on stage, you know, maybe later a female actress, to look at an interplay where the materiality is looked at from a complete different angle and becomes a co-performer or an animal or a tiny little invisible microbe. It's just a question of shifting spatial and temporal scales. And this is also for me cooperation in a way. I mean, I try to, I fail.
That's a beautiful example. It reminds me of the noise that you mentioned before in the research project where the noise all the scientists didn't take care of, and then the artist said, well, wait, there's something to be found here. Maybe I would like to pick up another term that was also part of the title of your project, the pharmacon, because it's another beautiful, I think this is the evening of in-betweeners. So we have the experiment as this in-between thing that unites the arts and the science. And maybe the pharmacon is another one because it's both remedy and poison. It's a nice medical context for that too. Oh, there's a question coming. So maybe we can go back to the pharmacon for a moment. Also what that kind of, I don't know, what that offers for the research, or like, I still haven't put it together, but the pharmacon seems to be something we should discuss again because it has the same in-between value as the experiment.
Yeah, I think I mentioned already that you could compare the pharmacon with what I call an unexpected or an unintended consequence. Because also in the example of Plato that you have been mentioning, and that Jacques Derrida is discussing at length in one of his articles, in one of his papers of the 1970s. Actually, the point is, and Derrida has a footnote there in this paper to which you have been referring, where he himself refers back to his own work of the 1960s, namely the grammatology, which has at least 1/3 of this book is concerned with another writer's idea of the origin of language and the origin of writing, namely Rousseau. And there he uses a different term for the term pharmacon, and he explicitly says in this footnote that probably the two terms could be used interchangeably, and that is the notion of supplement. We could translate it maybe as Zusatz, maybe also as Anhängsel, as something that appears to be insignificant at the beginning, but at the same time turns out to be recalcitrant, and it doesn't want to go away, and it can take over. And I think this is the essence of the pharmacon, that it can turn from a remedy into a poison, and the other way around.
Shortly about my fascination for the pharmacon, maybe not picking up what you just now said, but pointing to another additional meaning of it, that pharmacon also can be translated as color. So yeah, it's not makeup, but the materiality of the substance that is enabling, again, to make paintings. So there's so many layers and meanings of this word that relate somehow between the representation. So if we have a painting, it's representing something, but it's also coming from plants that we take as medicine or maybe as drug, or, you know, when we take a drug, we start to fantasize, and when we see images and we go into imagination. But the same substance, like a plant, can create color, it can create imagination, and it can create healing. So this is, I think, very exciting, in particular when you're between the fine arts and the performing arts that deal with perception and altering perception. So I think this is something why I'm still getting excited when I talk about the pharmacon. And another thing that makes it exciting, or maybe critical for me, is that I think we're also in an intoxicated society. So we're all, I don't know if we are all, but there is so much control that goes through the pharmaceutical industry, that imagining the society we live in and the power that a pharmacon has, if we take it as a remedy or a medicine, that it also turns for me into the notion of a weapon. So I'm just playing with these different ways to declinations of the term, and this leads me to different pieces of artworks that I make. Now I lost track.
But there's a follow-up question on that topic.
Yeah, Lucie, especially thank you for the last sentences, because it doesn't make my, it actually connects very well to my question, which is about this intersection within art and especially therapy, and so medicine in that sense. And I think it's a bit more psychological. So basically, my question considers the placement of art therapy. So using the art itself as the medicine, as we have it in like non-illustrative painting therapy, or like enclosed cognition and garment therapy. And there I was really wondering, because I think art is a form of communication, right? It's different forms of communication. And these therapies are definitely a form of experiment. So I was wondering where you would place, or musical therapy as well, where you would place these in between and within your two fields. So basically where you would house it, and as what you see yourself and what it is today. Yeah, that's it. I don't know if that's a very big question.
I have a quick impulse, because also you, Sasha, you're here. I think your question is also, there's a contemporary need, I think, to rethink the arts in a healing context. And also for some of these reasons, there was a workshop and seminar and symposium right now through the group of, maybe you want to say a few words. Is there something that you like to answer to this question? Because we had now just a couple of days ago a symposium on different also art therapy forms and explorations on this. Maybe there's something you like to say?
Since Sasha is an alumni of the healing arts, this is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, this working group that this workshop came out of is called Performing Science and Medicine. And there were, by chance, a number of projects that were interested in connections between art and medicine in terms of what could be sort of a healing practice. I think it was, so it's an interdisciplinary, on the topic of interdisciplinarity, interdisciplinary group of researchers from history, philosophy, science and technology studies, as well as artists working and talking together. But I think we were sort of talking through a tension of wanting to sometimes be able to use art and artistic research as a critical method, looking at science and medicine, sort of in line with, I think, a lot of what your work is, and then also the way that art gets taken up as a sort of curative or healing salve. And sometimes the tensions there also create an issue where art is meant to always act in this way, when sometimes actually it can be a poison in a way, that it's meant to actually produce something beyond healing or different than healing. So I think, but it's been interesting to sort of look at these therapeutic methods to see sort of the good and the bad too, that sometimes, you know, historically art therapy, for example, could be used, let's say in a carceral locale, so in a prison, in order to sort of dampen and suppress, whereas also it could be used in terms of self-exploration, these kinds of things that we think of as good. I don't know if this really answers the question, but I think actually it is interesting to think about this in the poison cure kind of mode of, yeah, in that.
I was very inspired in these days, because I realized that as an artist, I have to clearly distinguish between therapy and performative art practice, because the ethical dimensions can really go wrong. So if I apply somatic practice or art therapy in a rehearsal room where I intend to do a performance in the art world, I don't have the responsibility neither for the beholder, I mean, to some extent, and nor for my partners. But as soon as I have a patient, a relation to a patient, then I have to really clarify this. And we also had the situation at the event a couple of days ago where the informed consent was discussed. So if I apply therapeutic methods in a live performance that may cause whatever reaction that goes into a medical realm or therapeutic realm, I use the informed consent beforehand to clarify, first of all, you're doing this on your own risk, but sometimes we even apply this in the rehearsal groups. So I realize when I work with students and I teach performance art and I do breathing technique, and I'm not a therapist, it's a very, very fine line. That's what comes into my mind. So I think it makes sense that there are two different ways of education for it. So the experiment is for me only doable if I'm doing experiment among a group that all agrees that they're doing an artistic experiment, including therapeutical methods, maybe.
Thank you. I have one more question. It's actually perfectly aligned with your answer, but maybe also you already kind of answered it. But I wondered, while you were talking also of actually being a physician or scientist is a performance within like itself. If we talked about rituals, I think like a few sessions ago, and if performing it over and over again is actually already a performance or has an artistic expression. Also thinking of like the repetition, the costumes. I even thought about the exhaustion of a lot of like scientists and physicians, with like Abramovich also going to her physical limits, and like if it can be compared, and if it's just a very complex script, or maybe even performers put into place by maybe their employers, by the university, even learning the complex like performance basically, and if that would make people more critical of what they do actually, even publishing papers and so on, is it then for an audience, and like is it clear what the results are going to be, or would it also give people more freedom, or do people think about it already? I guess I just fingered on that question a bit and wonder what you think about it.
Maybe a good moment to distinguish between the term performativity and performance, which is very difficult. But maybe you like to introduce a little bit your take on the term performativity in your writing, or is this...
There is a lot of literature about performativity. Probably there are people that know more about it and have written more and thought more about it. But if we go back to the Latin meaning of it, literally, it means going beyond form, which means that what you are doing is in a way transformative, yeah? And this is very clear when you are doing experiments, scientific experiments. It is also clear when you are doing artistic experiments. When it comes to the interaction between medicine and the arts, and I hesitate to say something about it because I'm really not an expert in that. But I think there are more or less established forms of interactions where in one way or the other elements that are, and let me use it in that abstract way, elements that are coming from the realm of the arts find their entrance into medical practice. There are also a lot of historical examples. For instance, in psychiatry, if you think of the clinic of Navratil in the vicinity of Vienna in the 1960s, who was working with people who in one way or the other had some mental illnesses, and he was trying to elicit their own creativity as a curative element. So these people started to paint and created artworks that has become known under the label of art brut, and are now shown in all the big museums of the world. So you have these examples as well. And I think it is always good to detach oneself a little bit from the present situation and add a certain amount of historical reflexivity to what we are doing.
Thank you. And looking at the time, I have actually a whole list of questions here for you, but I would like to end on a personal note, because we started also on a personal note, since this is not the first conversation that the two of you had, and hope there will be many more. What is the most valuable thing that you have learned from one another? You from her, you from him.
Now, I think I have been, let me take the example where Lucie was organizing this event in Vienna 6 or 7 years ago. I forgot whether it was in 2018 or 2019. You have been talking briefly about it. I felt very uneasy, I must confess, during that performance sessions, because I was talking about the performativity of microbes, and doing experiments with living microbes is something that has, at the beginning of the of molecular biology, had a decisive influence of starting to understand genetics at the bacterial level. And these are experiments where viruses and bacteria get into interaction with each other and are fighting against each other. And you can make this visual in a petri dish in the form of plaques, and the different shape and the different color they have can tell you something about the genetic constitution of these things. But of course, if you are doing experiments with bacteria in a laboratory, you have to be very careful. This is the experience of microbiology of 100 years. Microbes can be very toxic, and there can always be mutations that are being harmful. And therefore, doing experiments with microbes, I always had the impression you need a closed space for it, and you need to make sure that it doesn't go beyond that space. And there somehow things went beyond that space. And I didn't know whether I should look at it as a violation of an agreement between microbiologists that you should never do these kinds of things, or to look at it as an artistic as an artistic event. To this day, I have no solution to this, but it made me deeply think about these interactions, and I think that has been the most important thing for me. Not that I was able to come up with a solution, but that I was confronted with this. Thank you.
For me, when I was reading the first time, I think it was Epistemologie des Konkreten. Ist der richtige Titel? It was, for me, a way to look at epistemology through a lens of a material, architectural, spatial composition. So since I'm thinking very much in form and proportions and less in terms of cognition, the way you were describing step by step how wetware, that is biological material, and hardware, instruments, interact, made me so particularly curious, and it developed such a scene that I was able to engage with this. So this way of detailed writing, but including spatial thinking, helped me to access epistemology in a way. And I think for today, it was just wonderful to hear one of the original meanings of performativity as something that goes, if I got it right, beyond form.
So thank you so much. We take this as the closing word, going beyond form. Thank you for being here. Thank you too for making it here. You from Vienna, you from here. And I wish you all a wonderful evening. We see each other again in 2 weeks' time for the next session of the Evenings. Thank you.